The southern sun beat down on the Montgomery plantation in 1872, but even its bright rays seemed to struggle against the oppressive quiet that hung in the air. The main house, a sprawling mansion of white columns and dark wood, stood like a silent judge over acres of manicured lawns. Everything about the place screamed wealth and history, but it wasn't the kind of history that people talked about openly. There was a heaviness to the air, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like something holding its breath. The grand facade, with its perfect symmetry and imposing size, held a secret, a deep, unsettling tension that you could almost taste. Even the birds seemed to sing a little softer here, their melodies muffled by something unseen. Inside, in the main parlor, the Montgomery family was preparing for their portrait. Mr. Montgomery, a man whose stern face seemed carved from granite, stood rigidly at the center. Beside him, Mrs. Montgomery, a woman whose beauty was only slightly softened by a thin, tight smile, held herself with an almost unnatural posture. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, were arranged around them, dressed in their finest clothes, their eyes wide and unblinking, trained on the camera. Their smiles were fixed, perfect, like they'd been painted on. You could see the effort in their faces, the strain of maintaining that veneer of perfection. Everything about them, from their silk dresses to their polished shoes, spoke of immense privilege, but also a strange, almost fragile control. The room itself was a showcase of their status. Heavy velvet drapes, polished mahogany furniture, and paintings of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you. The photographer, a man named Thomas, adjusted his camera, his hands a little more nervous than usual. He was meticulous, known for his steady hand and sharp eye, but today something felt off. He sensed an unspoken unease within the family, a quiet tension that vibrated just beneath their polished exteriors. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the angle of the light, the precise framing of the shot. He noticed the way Mr. Montgomery's jaw was clenched, the slight tremor in Mrs. Montgomery's hand as she adjusted her daughter's ribbon, small details that most people would miss, but Thomas saw everything. He was a professional, but he was also human, and the atmosphere in that room was getting to him. Behind the family, serving as a grand backdrop, was a heavy, dark red velvet curtain. It was meant to add depth and a touch of luxury to the photograph, its thick folds designed to create a rich, uniform background. Thomas had chosen it himself, admiring its deep color and the way it absorbed the light. It was an expensive piece, brought all the way from New Orleans, and it hung perfectly, concealing the wall behind it. Its texture was so plush, so dense, it felt like it could swallow sound or even light. It was a perfect barrier, a dark canvas against which the family's opulence would truly shine. As Thomas made his final adjustments, peering into the lens, he caught something, a fleeting, unidentifiable movement behind the curtain. It was quick, like a ripple in the fabric that shouldn't have been there, or a shadow that shifted too fast. He blinked, adjusting his focus, but it was gone. He dismissed it, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, perhaps his own anxiety playing games with his eyes. The long journey, the pressure of photographing such an important family, it was all getting to him. He shook his head slightly, trying to clear his mind, and focused back on the family. They remained frozen, their smiles still unnervingly perfect. "All right, everyone," Thomas said, his voice a little strained. "Just a moment longer. Hold still." He removed the lens cap. The room was silent, save for the faint tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. Then, with a sudden, brilliant flash of light, the photograph was taken. The family held their poses for another beat, then slowly relaxed, their strained smiles melting away. The atmosphere, though still tense, seemed to ease just a fraction. Thomas packed up his equipment, or feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering discomfort. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that he had seen something, even if his mind insisted it was nothing. Back in his portable dark room, a small enclosed space he'd set up in a spare room of the plantation, Thomas began the development process. He worked with practiced ease, his movements precise and economical. He dipped the glass plate into the chemicals, anticipating a routine development. He watched the image slowly begin to form, the outlines of the family appearing first, then the rich details of their clothing and the opulent parlor. Initially, there was nothing out of the ordinary. It looked like any other photograph he had taken, a perfect capture of a wealthy Southern family. But as the image continued to emerge, as the details sharpened, a faint, almost imperceptible distortion caught his eye. It was behind the curtain, a slight blur that seemed out of place. He frowned, holding the wet plate closer, tilting it under the dim red light. He chalked it up to a technical flaw, maybe a slight vibration when he took the shot, or an impurity in the chemicals. It was annoying, a blemish on what should have been a perfect photograph, but nothing more. He made a mental note to be more careful next time. Yet the blur didn't quite look like a technical flaw. As the image solidified further, the vague distortion began to take on a shape. It was faint, almost transparent, but undeniably humanoid. A prickle of discomfort started at the back of Thomas's neck. He tried to rationalize it again. Perhaps it was a fold in the curtain he hadn't noticed, catching the light in a strange way. But the more he looked, the more the shape seemed to resolve itself. It wasn't just a blur anymore. It was something that looked like a person. A strange chill ran through him, despite the warmth of the darkroom. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this image was deeply wrong. It was more than just a photographic anomaly. It felt like a presence. He hadn't yet seen the true revelation, the impossible detail that would turn his world upside down, but the unease had already begun to settle deep in his bones. The perfect, opulent scene he had captured was hiding something, and he had a terrible feeling he was about to find out what it was. The faint red glow of the darkroom lamp seemed to intensify the grotesque image forming on the glass plate. Thomas, now deeply disturbed, brought the wet plate closer, his hands steadying themselves on the edge of the developing tray. He leaned in, peering through a small magnifying glass he kept for inspecting fine details. His breath hitched in his throat. The blurry shape, which he had tried to dismiss as a trick of light or a technical flaw, was now undeniably a figure. It was emaciated, almost skeletal. Gaunt, hollowed-out cheeks, eyes sunken deep into their sockets, gave its face a skull-like appearance. Its mouth was open slightly, as if in a silent gasp or a perpetual scream. The skin, where visible, looked stretched and thin over protruding bones. The figure's posture was twisted, contorted, as if it were in constant agony, struggling against unseen bonds. It wasn't just thin. It looked starved, wasted away. This was no living person. This was something else entirely. What shocked him even more was its clothing. It was a tattered, grimy dress, made of a coarse, homespun fabric that looked decades, perhaps even a century, out of date. It was the kind of clothing a field hand or a servant might have worn in a bygone era, certainly not something seen in 1872, and definitely not in the opulent parlor of the Montgomery family. The fabric hung loosely on its withered frame, stained with what looked like dirt and decay. The stark contrast between the figure's ancient, decaying attire and the crisp, fashionable clothes of the Montgomery family in the foreground was jarring, a clash of worlds. Despite the chilling presence of this spectral being, the Montgomery family in the photograph remained perfectly composed. The patriarch, still with his rigid, almost forced smile, looked directly at the camera. The matriarch and the children, equally unperturbed, maintained their elegant poses. They were oblivious, utterly unaware of the horrific entity standing just inches behind the heavy velvet curtain, right in their own parlor. It created a profound sense of temporal and spatial impossibility. How could something so clearly visible, so tangibly there in the image, have been invisible to everyone present at the time the photograph was taken? Thomas pulled the magnifying glass away, his mind reeling. He meticulously checked his equipment. The camera lens was clean, free of smudges or defects. The glass plate itself was pristine, no scratches or imperfections. His chemicals were fresh, mixed precisely according to formula. He replayed the entire process in his mind, step by step, from setting up the shot to the final exposure. There had been no anomalies, no sudden movements, no double exposure. He was a professional, known for his precision. He knew his craft. This was not a technical error. The impossibility was confirmed. This image was real. A wave of genuine, bone-chilling fear washed over him. His hands started to tremble uncontrollably, the wet plate rattling slightly. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This defied all logic, all reason. He was a man of science, of empirical observation. But what he held in his hands was supernatural, a ghost captured on silver halide. It was a face from a nightmare, caught in an eternal moment of suffering, and it was undeniably present in the family portrait. He brought the magnifying glass back to the figure's face, compelled by a morbid curiosity he couldn't control, and then he saw it. The sunken eyes of the spectral figure were not vacant. They were fixed, not on the Montgomery family, not on the room, but directly on him. It was as if the figure, trapped in that moment of 1872, was somehow perceiving him, a man from the future, looking back through the lens of time. Its gaze seemed to penetrate the glass, the chemicals, the years, and lock onto his own. A silent scream seemed to emanate from its open mouth, directed solely at him. The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through his entire body. It was seeing him. The realization dawned, cold and stark. This was not just a photographic anomaly, a random trick of light. This was evidence of a hidden, terrifying truth connected to the plantation, and almost certainly to the seemingly perfect Montgomery family themselves. This emaciated figure, trapped behind the curtain, was a silent witness, a victim, a haunting that had manifested itself in the most unexpected way. It was a secret, brought into the light by the very act of trying to preserve a facade of normalcy. Overcome with dread, a desperate decision formed in his mind. He couldn't deliver this photograph. He simply couldn't. What would the Montgomery family say? What would they do? More importantly, what would he do with an image that defied reality? He had to destroy it, or at the very least, he had to hide it. He couldn't let anyone else see this. He couldn't let anyone else know. But even as he thought this, the image burned itself into his mind. The gaunt face, the sunken eyes, the contorted agony. It was a silent scream from another dimension, a desperate plea, and it had forever altered his perception of reality. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his life would never be the same. The perfect, pristine facade of the Montgomery family, and indeed of the world itself, had been shattered by a single, impossible image. The photographer, deeply shaken, carefully placed the impossible photograph into a thick, light-proof envelope. He then locked the envelope inside a sturdy wooden box, which he then tucked away in the darkest corner of his studio's safe. He tried to dismiss it all as a hallucination, a trick of his own tired mind, or perhaps an elaborate, cruel prank someone had played on him. But the image burned into his memory was simply too vivid, too real, too undeniably present. He could still see the gaunt face, the pleading eyes, the faint outline of a skeletal hand reaching out from behind that heavy velvet curtain. It wasn't a prank, it was something else entirely. His mind, despite his efforts to push it away, kept returning to the Montgomery plantation. He couldn't bring himself to confront the family directly, not yet. The thought of facing them, knowing what he now knew, was too much. But the house, the land, the very air around that place felt different to him now. He started recalling fragments of local lore, hushed conversations he'd overheard in taverns and general stores over the years. These were the unsettling local legends, the kind people usually dismissed as old wives' tales, but which now took on a terrifying new significance. He remembered Old Man Hemlock, the town's resident eccentric, who used to sit on the porch of the general store, muttering about the shadows that walk the Montgomery land. People would just laugh, or nod politely and move on. But now the photographer could almost hear the tremor in Hemlock's voice, the genuine fear behind his rambling words. There were stories of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances of workers years ago, always hushed up, always blamed on runaways or bad luck. A general aura of dread surrounded the Montgomery estate, a feeling he had always attributed to its isolated grandeur, but which now felt like a palpable presence. The plantation's dark history began to surface in his thoughts. He knew, everyone in the region knew, that places like the Montgomery estate were built on a foundation of brutal labor and suffering. The grandeur he had admired earlier now felt like a thin veil, barely covering a deep, festering horror. He remembered seeing old shackles in a forgotten shed once, dismissed by a grinning overseer as old farming tools. He remembered the weary, silent faces of the few remaining older servants, their eyes holding a depth of sorrow that had always puzzled him. Now it made a terrible, awful sense. A specific childhood memory resurfaced, chilling him to the bone. He had been just a boy, maybe 7 or 8, listening to an old woman named Clara. She had once worked for the Montgomerys generations ago, and was now a washerwoman for his own family. Clara had a haunted look in her eyes whenever the Montgomery name came up. One stormy night, huddled by the fire, she had told him a story, whispering about the little one who never left. She spoke of a young girl, barely a teenager, who had been locked away in a hidden room for a perceived transgression, left to waste away. Clara had cried as she told the story, begging him never to speak of it. He had forgotten it, or rather, pushed it deep into the recesses of his mind, dismissing it as a morbid fairy tale. Now, that memory resurfaced with horrifying clarity. The little one who never left. The Montgomery family's reputation, while outwardly one of respectability and immense wealth, also carried subtle suggestions of a coldness, a ruthlessness. People spoke of their fierce pride, their unwavering control, and a hidden darkness within their lineage, known only to a few, whispered about in hushed tones. They were powerful, untouchable. Now their polished facade seemed to crack, revealing the monstrous underbelly he was beginning to perceive. The photographer began to connect the impossible figure in the photograph with these fragmented stories and the plantation's dark history. The figure was not random. It was a manifestation of something specific, something deeply rooted in the very soil of that place. The gaunt features, the emaciated form, the posture of agony, it all aligned with the image Clara had painted of the little one. The notion of a curse, or a deep, persistent haunting, began to take shape in his mind. The figure was a trapped spirit, a victim seeking recognition, a silent scream that had finally found a way to be heard. It was not just a ghost, it was a testament, a spectral witness to a historical wrong. His initial fear, though still present, began to transform into a morbid curiosity. It became an urgent, almost desperate need to understand the truth behind the impossible photograph. He felt compelled to investigate further, to piece together the fragments of horror, to give a name and a story to the silent figure in his plate. He knew it was dangerous, that he was treading on ground best left undisturbed, but he couldn't stop. The past, long buried under layers of wealth and silence, was now clawing its way back into the present, demanding to be seen and heard through the most unlikely medium, a single, impossible photograph. The photographer, his mind now a whirlwind of unsettling memories and chilling possibilities, wasted no time. Driven by an insatiable, almost feverish need for answers, he began his secret research into the Montgomery family's history and the plantation's dark past. He knew he couldn't just walk up to the Montgomerys and ask questions. Their power and influence were too great. Instead, he adopted a quiet, methodical approach, starting with the most accessible sources. He spent countless hours in the dusty archives of the local historical society, poring over brittle, yellowed newspapers from decades past. He visited the county courthouse, sifting through property deeds, birth records, and old legal documents. The clerks, used to researchers interested in genealogy or local history, paid him little mind, allowing him to work undisturbed. He pretended to be compiling a history of prominent local families, a plausible cover story for his intense scrutiny of the Montgomery name. His efforts uncovered fragmented records, old newspaper clippings detailing social events, land purchases, and the occasional minor scandal involving distant relatives. There were mentions of successful harvests, lavish parties, and philanthropic donations, all contributing to the Montgomerys' carefully constructed image. But beneath the surface, he started to find faint traces of something else. Obscure legal documents, often concerning land disputes or vague settlements, hinted at disturbing events, but nothing explicit, nothing that spelled out the horror he suspected. It was like looking at a torn tapestry, seeing glimpses of a pattern without being able to make out the whole picture. Then, a recurring, vague reference caught his eye. It was a name, always appearing in the margins, in footnotes, or in brief, almost accidental mentions. Ilara. She was described inconsistently, sometimes as a ward, other times as a distant cousin, or simply a young woman in their care. What was consistent, however, was her sudden disappearance from the plantation generations ago. Her fate was never officially recorded. There were no death certificates, no records of her leaving, just a gaping void where her life should have continued. The more he found her name, the more unsettling it became. The fragments of information, rather than clarifying, only deepened the mystery surrounding this Ilara. What struck him most was the conspicuous absence of official records regarding Ilara's disappearance. For a family as prominent and meticulous as the Montgomerys, such a void was not accidental. It suggested a deliberate cover-up, a concerted effort to erase her from history. Any records that might have existed seemed to have vanished, or were perhaps never created in the first place. This absence spoke volumes, confirming his growing suspicion that something truly sinister had occurred. He cautiously approached the older residents of the nearby town, people who had lived there their entire lives, whose families had served or worked alongside the Montgomerys for generations. He started by asking about local history, then gently steered the conversation towards the old plantation. Most spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. They avoided direct names or details when the incident at the Montgomery plantation was mentioned, but they conveyed a palpable sense of fear, a deep-seated apprehension that transcended simple gossip. They spoke of bad luck and shadows, but never elaborated, their words laced with an unspoken understanding that some things were better left unsaid. One old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, simply made the sign of the cross when he mentioned the Montgomery name, and hurried away. As he gathered these fragmented descriptions of Ilara, piecing together scraps of memory from the old-timers, a chilling realization began to dawn on him. Though vague and often contradictory in minor details, the core description of Ilara, young, slender, with a certain haunted quality, began to align unnervingly with the gaunt features of the figure in the photograph. The emaciated form, the posture of suffering, the almost ethereal quality of the apparition. It was Ilara. This strengthened his conviction, cementing the impossible connection between the past and his photographic plate. His research led him to old maps and architectural drawings of the plantation, stored away in the county archives. He noticed something unusual, a section of the plantation grounds, far from the main house, that was depicted as walled off or marked as private access only. It didn't appear on modern blueprints, almost as if it had been intentionally omitted or physically removed. He also found references to a forgotten annex, a small detached building that had once served an unknown purpose, later described as dilapidated, and eventually simply gone. He also learned that certain parts of the plantation grounds, particularly near this walled-off area and the location of the old annex, were always considered off-limits or unlucky by generations of workers. Stories persisted of strange noises coming from that direction at night, of animals refusing to go near it, and of an oppressive chill that lingered even on the hottest days. These were the same kinds of stories he had dismissed as superstitions in his youth, but now they resonated with a terrifying truth. His investigation was becoming increasingly dangerous. He felt eyes on him, not always physical ones, but a sense of being watched, of encroaching on forbidden territory. He sensed he was treading on ground the Montgomery family desperately wanted to keep buried, secrets that had been protected with ruthless efficiency for generations. The veiled warnings he received from some of the less reluctant old-timers became more pointed, advising him to mind his own business and not stir up old ghosts. He knew he was risking everything, but the face in the photograph, Alara's face, compelled him onward. Each piece of information, no matter how small or how difficult to obtain, formed a mosaic of horror, pointing directly to the impossible figure as a victim of the plantation's dark and unforgiving legacy. He had to know the full story. The Montgomery family's response to his inquiries was swift and unsettling. It started subtly, with polite but firm letters from their lawyers, advising him that his continued interest in their family history was unwarranted and disturbing the peace. Then came the visits. A tall, silent man, always dressed in dark clothes, would appear near his studio, simply watching. He never spoke, never approached, but his presence was a clear, unspoken warning. One evening, a brick wrapped in an anonymous note landed through his window. The note contained only 2 words: "Stop digging." Their actions, far from deterring him, only confirmed his deepest suspicions. They were hiding something so profound and terrible that they would resort to intimidation to keep it buried. He returned to the original, impossible photograph, placing it on his work table under the soft glow of his lamp. He studied it for hours, seeing it with new eyes. Before, he had focused on the figure, on the impossibility. Now he looked at the family. The patriarch, Montgomery Sr., had a fixed, almost brittle smile. The matriarch, her posture rigid, held a fan so tightly her knuckles were white. But it was the subtle details that truly struck him. In the matriarch's eyes, a flicker of something he hadn't noticed before. Not fear exactly, but a deep, weary sadness, almost a resignation. The children, usually so lively, seemed unnaturally still, their eyes wide and a little vacant. He realized now that this wasn't just a formal portrait, it was a performance, a desperate attempt to project an image of perfect normalcy over an abyss of unspoken horror. He noticed the figure behind the curtain again, its position. It wasn't just there, a random apparition. It was directly behind the youngest daughter, almost as if clinging to her, or perhaps trying to reach out to her. The girl's head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. He shivered, a cold dread washing over him. Was Alara trying to communicate with her own family through the photograph? Even then, was she trying to expose the truth to one of them, hoping for a moment of recognition, a flicker of remorse? A chance encounter with an old retired clerk from the county registrar's office proved to be a turning point. The clerk, a frail man who had no love for the Montgomery family, spoke in hushed tones about an old property dispute, a forgotten will, and a family secret that had been aggressively suppressed. He mentioned Alara's name, not as a servant, but as a problem. He spoke of her mother, a distant cousin of the Montgomery patriarch who had fallen on hard times and sought refuge on the plantation. Alara, then, was not just a worker, but a distant, unacknowledged relative, a shared bloodline. This added a layer of familial horror to the tragedy. It wasn't just a cruel act against a worker, it was a betrayal of family, a dark stain on their lineage that they had worked tirelessly to erase. The motive for Alara's disappearance became chillingly clear. It wasn't just about silencing a servant, it was about concealing a scandal, an inheritance dispute perhaps, or an even darker act of unspeakable cruelty within the family itself, something that would threaten their carefully constructed image of respectability and power. Her very existence, especially if she had any claim to their name or property, would have been a direct threat to their standing in society. As he delved deeper, the line between his waking hours and his dreams began to blur. He experienced vivid nightmares, flashes of the past that felt terrifyingly real. He saw Alara, gaunt and desperate, her eyes pleading. He felt her terror, her despair, a crushing sense of confinement. Sometimes he would wake with a gasp, certain he had heard her whisper his name, a faint, mournful sound carried on the wind. It was as if her spirit, stirred by his investigation, was reaching out to him, trying to guide him, to tell her story through him. He felt her presence, not as a malevolent ghost, but as a trapped soul, yearning for release. The heavy velvet curtain in the photograph, which had originally seemed merely a grand backdrop, now took on a new, ominous symbolism. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was a literal barrier, A barrier between the living and the dead, between the seen and the unseen, between the truth and the elaborate cover-up. It was the veil behind which Alara was hidden, a silent witness to her suffering, a metaphor for the secrets the Montgomery family kept. He realized the haunting wasn't just a static image trapped on a plate. It was an active, persistent manifestation, a desperate cry for justice or recognition. The figure wasn't just accidentally there, it was trying to communicate. Alara was trying to break through the temporal barrier, using the photograph as her medium, her last desperate attempt to tell her story to someone who would listen. A profound moral obligation settled upon him. This wasn't merely a fascinating mystery anymore. He felt a deep connection to Alara, a responsibility to her memory. He had to expose the truth, despite the personal danger, despite the horrifying implications for his own life and reputation. The thought of backing down, of letting her story remain untold, was unbearable. The photograph was no longer just a picture. It was a window into a crime, a cry for help from beyond the grave. And he, the photographer, was now inextricably linked to its chilling secret, a reluctant participant in a drama that had unfolded decades before his birth. He was Alara's last hope, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not fail her. The weight of Alara's plea pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of responsibility. He had the photograph, the fragments of history, the whispers of the past. But he needed more. He needed undeniable proof, a voice from within the Montgomery's own circle to confirm the horror. And then a letter arrived, slipped under his darkroom door one late evening, its elegant script trembling slightly. It was from an old woman, Martha, who had served the Montgomery family for over 60 years, first as a kitchen maid, then as a housekeeper. Her words were brief, urgent, and filled with a desperate plea for a meeting. She was old, she wrote, and her time was short. There were things she needed to say before she went to her grave. He found Martha in a small weathered cottage on the outskirts of town, her tiny frame almost swallowed by a worn armchair. Her eyes, though clouded by age, held a sharp, knowing glint. She offered him weak tea, her hands shaking as she poured. "You've been asking questions about Alara?" she rasped, her voice thin as old paper. He nodded, suddenly feeling a knot in his stomach. This was it, the moment of truth. Martha began to speak, her words slow and deliberate, painting a picture of a past so cruel it made his blood run cold. Alara, she confirmed, was indeed a distant cousin, brought to the plantation under the guise of being cared for after her parents died. But it was a lie. The Montgomerys feared her claim to a small but significant piece of land, a parcel that bordered their own vast estate. They couldn't let it fall into other hands, especially not hands that might one day challenge their authority. So Alara wasn't cared for. She was imprisoned. Martha described a small windowless room in the oldest part of the house, a forgotten annex that didn't appear on any modern blueprints. It was a place servants whispered about, a sick room or a storage room, but Martha knew its true purpose. She would sneak scraps of food to Alara when she could, listen to her desperate pleas, and witness her slow, agonizing decline. Alara was kept there, day after day, week after week, slowly wasting away, her spirit broken, her body starved. The family feared a public scandal if she simply vanished, so they chose a slower, more insidious method of removal. They wanted her to disappear without a trace, leaving no evidence of their monstrous act. Martha's voice cracked as she recalled Ilara's final days. The young woman, once vibrant and full of life, had become a shadow, her skin stretched tight over bone, her eyes hollow and filled with a profound sadness. She had tried to escape once, Martha said, clawing at the thick wooden door, her desperate cries muffled by the heavy walls. But she was too weak. She succumbed to her torment, alone and forgotten, in that dark room. Her body was then secretly buried in an unmarked grave deep in the forbidden woods, a place the Montgomerys claimed was unlucky. The details Martha provided were precise, chillingly so. The location of the crime, the specific room, the methods of her torment, the complicity of the household staff, who were too terrified to speak. It all aligned perfectly with the fragmented clues he had gathered. The forbidden annex, the unlucky woods. It wasn't superstition, it was a cover-up. As Martha spoke, the figure in the photograph swam before his eyes. Alara, her emaciated form, her sunken eyes, her posture of contorted agony. It was her, exactly as Martha described her in her final moments. The photograph wasn't just a random anomaly, it was a direct imprint of her suffering, a visual testament to her tragic end. Martha, her voice barely a whisper now, confirmed it. "She's still there," she said, pointing a trembling finger at an old faded copy of a newspaper clipping he had brought. showing the Montgomery family's house. "She's always been there, watching, waiting." The nature of the impossible suddenly became terrifyingly clear. Alara's torment was so profound, her desperation for justice so immense, that it had left an indelible mark on reality itself. Her suffering had created a temporal anomaly, a ripple in time that allowed her image, her very essence, to manifest in that 1872 photograph. She wasn't just a ghost, she was a physical manifestation of a deep, unhealed wound. The Montgomery family's depravity was laid bare. Generations of complicity, of cold-blooded calculation, of silencing truth with intimidation and murder. Their grand facade, their opulent lifestyle, was built on a foundation of unspeakable cruelty and a monstrous secret. Martha's confession was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. A moral imperative now burned within him, hotter and fiercer than ever before. Hiding the photograph was no longer an option. It wasn't enough to simply know the truth. He had to act. He had to bring justice, or at least peace, to Alara. Her spirit, trapped for so long, deserved recognition. He looked at Martha, her weary eyes reflecting a lifetime of unspoken horror. He knew then that he had to be Alara's voice. The confession had provided the missing pieces, transforming the impossible image into a horrifying, undeniable truth, demanding action. He left Martha's cottage with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying not just a story but a sacred trust. The photographer's mind raced as he walked away from Martha's cottage. The weight of her confession pressed down on him, but it also sharpened his resolve. He held the key to unlocking a terrible secret, a truth that had been buried for decades. He had the photograph, an impossible piece of evidence, and now he had the full, horrifying story of Alara's suffering. His path was clear, but fraught with danger. The Montgomery family would not take kindly to their carefully constructed world being dismantled. He knew they would fight back, fiercely and without mercy. He spent the next few days planning his moves with meticulous care. He couldn't just walk into the town square and brandish the photograph. He'd be dismissed as a lunatic, or worse, disappear himself. He needed to present the evidence in a way that commanded attention, that forced people to look, to believe. The photograph itself was his most potent weapon. Its impossibility was its power. It defied logic, yet there it was, undeniable proof of something beyond comprehension. He thought about the public's reaction. There would be shock, horror, disbelief, but the image once seen couldn't be unseen. It would haunt their thoughts, just as it haunted his. As he prepared, a strange shift occurred around him. The subtle manifestations he had experienced before began to intensify. A cold spot would suddenly appear in his study, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. He'd hear faint whispers like dry leaves rustling, just at the edge of his hearing, always seeming to urge him forward. Once he caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadow, tall and gaunt, in his peripheral vision, only for it to vanish when he turned his head. He knew it was Alara. Her presence was stronger now, closer, as if she sensed his intent, her spirit stirring with a desperate hope for justice. It wasn't frightening in the same way it had been when he first saw her in the photograph. Now it felt like a plea, a spectral ally in his grim mission. He decided against a direct confrontation with the Montgomerys. That would be foolish, playing right into their hands. Instead, he chose a public forum, a local exhibition of photography, where his work, including the infamous portrait, would be displayed. He meticulously prepared a small, discreet exhibit, placing the Montgomery family portrait prominently, but with a slight, almost imperceptible tilt, drawing the eye to the space behind the curtain. Beside it, he planned to display a carefully worded anonymous note, hinting at the true story, urging viewers to look closer, to truly see what was hidden. He also prepared copies of the fragmented records, old newspaper clippings, and a carefully anonymized account of Martha's testimony to be distributed subtly among influential townspeople. The Montgomery family, however, was already moving. Their network of informants was vast. Whispers of the photographer's intense research, his strange questions, and his newfound resolve had reached them. He received an anonymous letter, not a threat, but a chillingly polite suggestion to cease his current endeavors, for the sake of his reputation and well-being. Then came the visits. Men in dark suits, always courteous, always smiling, but with eyes that promised extreme unpleasantness if he didn't comply. They offered him money, a substantial sum, to simply forget about the project. When he refused, the smiles vanished. The veiled threats became less veiled, hinting at accidents, misfortunes, things that could befall a man who meddled in affairs that weren't his. One night, his darkroom was ransacked, but nothing was stolen. It was a clear message. They knew where he kept his work, and they could get to him whenever they wished. He felt the fear, a cold knot in his stomach, but Alara's faint whispers seemed to grow louder, pushing him past his terror. He had made a promise, not just to Martha, but to a tormented soul. He would not back down. The exhibition opened to a modest crowd. People milled about, admiring the landscapes and portraits. Then they reached his display. The Montgomery family portrait, usually a symbol of prestige, now drew curious stares. People noticed the subtle tilt, the way the light seemed to fall just so, emphasizing the curtain. A few, guided by the anonymous hints he had planted, leaned in closer, squinting. Then a gasp, another. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. They saw it, the gaunt figure, the impossible presence behind the curtain. The impossible photograph was doing its work. The whispers quickly turned into an uproar. The town, usually so keen to uphold appearances, was gripped by a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. The accompanying stories, circulated by his trusted few, began to connect the dots. The old legends, Ilara's disappearance, the Montgomerys' long-standing reputation for ruthlessness. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. The impossible photograph, once a private horror, was now a public spectacle, a chilling indictment. The Montgomery family's carefully constructed world imploded. Their social standing, their business dealings, their very name were shattered. Legal inquiries, fueled by public outrage and the growing body of evidence, were launched. Though direct legal repercussions for a long-past crime were complex, the court of public opinion delivered a swift and brutal verdict. They faced ostracization, financial ruin, and the chilling scorn of a community that now saw them for what they truly were. As the truth unfurled, the manifestations of Ilara's spirit began to subside. The cold spots lessened, the whispers faded. He still felt her presence, but it was different now. A sense of quiet gratitude, a peaceful release. It was as if, with the truth finally out, her tormented spirit could finally rest. The photographer himself was forever marked by the experience. He carried the weight of what he had witnessed, the horror of Ilara's story, but also the profound satisfaction of having given a voice to the voiceless. He became a recluse, his work now focused on capturing the unseen, the overlooked, forever changed by his encounter with the impossible. The power of a single image combined with unwavering resolve had pierced through decades of deception, bringing long-awaited justice, even from beyond the grave. The Montgomery plantation, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood as a grim testament to its dark past. Its grand facade, which had once masked unspeakable cruelty, crumbled slowly under the weight of public condemnation and neglect. Weeds choked the manicured gardens, paint peeled from the stately columns, and windows stared out like vacant eyes. The vibrant life that had once filled its halls had fled, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the wind whistling through broken panes. It became an object of morbid curiosity, a place whispered about in hushed tones, a monument not to grandeur but to past horrors. No one wanted to buy it, no one dared to live in it. It was simply left to decay, a constant physical reminder of the secrets it held. The impossible photograph, the very image that had brought down the Montgomery name, became a historical artifact. It was displayed in hushed museums, studied by academics, debated by skeptics, and feared by many. It was a chilling testament not just to the supernatural but to the enduring power of human suffering and the lengths to which people would go to hide their transgressions. Copies circulated, sparking endless discussions about its authenticity, its meaning, and the very fabric of reality. People stared, mesmerized and horrified, at the gaunt figure behind the velvet curtain, a silent scream frozen in time. It was a picture that defied explanation, a permanent scar on the historical record. The photographer, having fulfilled his grim duty, lived out his days haunted but, in a strange way, at peace. The experience had carved a deep groove into his soul, leaving him forever changed. He became a recluse, his camera now focused less on capturing beauty and more on finding the hidden truths, the unseen stories that lay beneath the surface of everyday life. He was a keeper of dark knowledge, a man who had seen the impossible and lived to tell the tale, albeit to a select few. His eyes held a depth that few understood, a quiet understanding of the world's hidden layers. He continued his craft, but with a new purpose, a silent promise to those who had been silenced. He never sought fame for his role in exposing the Montgomerys, content with the quiet satisfaction of justice served. Ilara's story, once buried and forgotten, now became a cautionary tale. It was a powerful reminder of the atrocities committed in the name of power and prestige, and of the spirits that linger, demanding remembrance. Her name, once erased from history, was now spoken with reverence and sorrow. She became a symbol for all those who suffered in silence, a testament to the fact that even the most vulnerable can, through impossible means, find their voice. Her suffering was no longer in vain. It served as a stark warning, a beacon against the darkness of human cruelty. The entire episode forced a reflection on the very nature of hauntings. They were not just random occurrences people began to understand, but deep emotional imprints, echoes of of unresolved suffering that could manifest in the most impossible ways. They were the universe's way of correcting an imbalance, of bringing justice where none had been found in life. Alara's image was proof that profound pain could transcend the boundaries of time and space, a physical manifestation of a broken spirit demanding to be heard. It was a terrifying, yet strangely comforting thought. The image of the curtain itself, the heavy velvet backdrop that had both concealed and revealed, remained an enduring symbol. It represented the thin veil between worlds, the delicate boundary between the seen and the unseen, and the profound secrets hidden beneath the seemingly perfect lives of others. It showed how easily truth could be obscured, but also how, given the right circumstances, it could burst forth, undeniable and terrifying. The curtain was a metaphor for all the lies we tell ourselves and others, and the inevitable moment when those lies are pulled back. Even though Alara had seemingly found peace, the narrative of the plantation's dark history hinted that her story might not be the only one. A pervasive sense of dread continued to cling to the land, an unspoken promise that other, less specific entities or echoes of past suffering might still linger. The ground itself seemed to remember, to hold the pain of generations. The air was heavy with unspoken stories, a constant reminder that the Montgomery's crimes were but one chapter in a much larger, darker book. The peace Alara found was hers alone, but the land remained scarred. The story ultimately concluded with a thought-provoking question to anyone who heard it, challenging them to consider what other impossible truths might be hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. How many other Alaras were out there, trapped in old photographs, in abandoned houses, in forgotten stories? What horrors were we unknowingly walking past every day? It was an unsettling realization, a call to look closer, to listen more carefully, to question the perfect facades. The enduring fear left by the impossible photograph was the unsettling realization that some horrors are not confined to the past. They can reach out, touch the present, and manifest when least expected, shattering our understanding of reality. The 1872 photograph served as a permanent, chilling reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some victims will find a way to be seen, even across the chasm of time, demanding their due.